started in 2017, specifically because my co-founder and I had really begun to notice the massive amount of online propaganda that really were essentially shifting public perception and people's perception about a wide variety of critical topics. And we really started to envision a future that the information ecosystem was rendered unusable and created these kind of warped realities that we see today in 2023. Our mission is to foster trust, safety, and integrity across the information ecosystem. And we do that, being technologists through technology products. What we think of as narrative attacks, I would define as any kind of assertion within that information ecosystem, which are all the interconnected communication networks, including social media and things of that nature, any kind of assertion in that space that aims to shift public perception about a person, place, or thing. And that thing could be, by the way, a product, a policy, an ingredient. And the problem really becomes any kind of narrative or online story that takes enough traction, gets enough hold in the space to become very visible, becomes the target of any number of special interest groups and hyper agenda driven factions, including state actors that drive more attention in a synthetic manner to that narrative to make it seem like it's a bigger problem than it may be. And that can create a completely new threat vector that is designed to shift public perception at scale. And this is an entirely new tradecraft that public and private sector stakeholders are simply not prepared for today. We've spent the past 7 years and considerable time and energy in building a technology platform that looks at a very specialized set of signals designed to detect and assist in mitigation around narrative attacks. We actually have a 5-point system for this that I could just explain quickly. First, we're using artificial intelligence to understand narratives as they propagate across multiple platforms. So, what are all the different permutations around a particular storyline that are developing, right? So that's just the narrative, though. That's narrative in its base form, conversations online. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no real inherent risk in just those narratives. What is important is to detect when there might be significant harm to a particular organization or entity. So we look at things like the network that narrative is propagating through, so the rate at which that narrative propagates, and which different areas and platforms it's spreading to. So it's the contagion effect of the narrative. We then look at something called cohorts, what we call cohorts. These are communities that might be bolstering that particular narrative. And at this point, the true risk hasn't entered the equation. But then we start looking at things like anomalous activity. We could be looking at things like calls to violence. We could be looking at things like bot networks and synthetic amplification. And then we look at something, that we look at as influence. And that's, a very common term today because of influencers and whatnot. And what we're thinking about when we're looking at influence are more what we call shadow influencers. And these are accounts, different nodes in that network that could essentially drive a lot of the conversation, but they're really doing it in artificial ways. So think small number of accounts creating tons of different comments and posts that can make a problem seem larger than it is. And when a problem seems larger than it is online, if you're making decisions on the other side, it's easy to make very flawed strategic decisions based on that data that's designed to deceive. The key here is being able to do all of those things very fast at high speeds with high resolution. And so the gaps that they've actually had are all of these kind of different areas that are filled in when the typical, somewhat legacy system only looks at keyword mentions, how many times the keyword is mentioned, and I would say a sprinkling of AI, meaning positive, negative sentiment, some emotional classifiers. If you think about the method that I looked at, the gaps that are filled are looking at, that our company looks at are narratives, anomalous activity within those narratives, the rate of spread and information flow. If you think about how different the resolution is on those two approaches, all you have to think about is if you just spam, a threat actor spams a company name or a particular narrative 100,000 times, on one system, you're just going to see this big, massive engagement around that one thing, but you're not going to know anything else about it. You're not going to know the properties, the historical kind of footprint around similar events that have occurred before by the same threat actors. it just gives you so much more resolution that you can act quick, and it drives strategic foresight for these positions and these executives. I can just give a base example during the Russia Ukraine conflict when it started up. There was, everybody knows there was this kind of mass exodus of boycotts, or rather, companies pulling out and being boycotted if they didn't. And one of the things that started happening is there were massive, essentially, you could say, narrative attacks driving significant pressure for companies to essentially pull out, right? And one organization we worked with was trying to understand, do we stay in, do we get out? And what we provided them was very concrete evidence that a lot of the harshest critique around their organization was in fact bot network driven. Based on that, they were able to say, well, our authentic audience, it does not actually feel this way. And so they made a decision in that case that actually saved them billions in terms of their overall footprint, and they ended up really later on realizing they absolutely made the right decision and would not have been able to make it without that level of fidelity around the information that they were trying to derive a decision out of. So I think that's one really good kind of corporate example. And on the national security side, there are very similar use cases you can imagine that are geopolitical in nature that you can pull out of the system if you can process all of these signals quickly at the time of a critical event. One of the things that are most straightforward about the system as it relates to tailoring is that we don't really need to do custom deployments for all of these different verticals and sectors, or even between public and private sector. And that is because we have something called an adaptable AI framework. So if you think about that 5-point framework I mentioned, the cohorts, the anomalous activity, you as an analyst can actually be in the system and create a composite risk index that is customizable for your risk profile. And so the beauty of the system is you can almost like you're writing a Boolean, but instead the Boolean is stringing together our different AI models and the different thresholds for those. And since there is no one size fits all for this type of risk and for a narrative attack, this is what enables people to tailor it for their own risk profiles and needs.